Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulil Kareem. Alhamdulillah, we are back to continue about the life of Imam Ibn Al-Jawzi. And the next thing that I wanted to ask Shaykh is, could you please tell us about the written legacy of Imam Abdur-Rahman Ibn Al-Jawzi?
Alhamdulillah. Salatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Okay, so when discussing Imam Ibn Al-Jawzi rahimahullah's written legacy, he pretty much left a book in all of the usul sciences of Islam as well as funun regarding plenary sciences, which will be things like astronomy and things like this. Now, what triggered him to usually write a book, he'll explain in the introduction of his kitab. For example, in the introduction to At-Tahqiq, his book called At-Tahqiq, which is his hadith discussion book on disputation regarding ahadith and Bukhari, Muslim, and other collections. He said that he found among the early elders that they would say, Imam Ahmed collected this. Abu Bakr al-Khalal collected this. But they would not mention the collectors such as Abu Dawood, Muslim, and Al-Bukhari, because their source is Ahmed, because he's the sheikh of the school and such. So they would not be saying Rawahu al-Bukhari or Rawahu Muslim, Rawahu Abu Dawood. He wasn't saying that. They weren't saying that. And Imam Al-Jawzi rahimahullah said, this could breed laziness because we have all of these hadith scholars, they are our own, but we have to have the ability to share these with the wider body of people. So what I will do in this work of mine is I will begin to share the legacy. So Imam Al-Jawzi rahimahullah opened up the vastness of the hadith legacy by starting to use words like Al-Bukhari collected this, Muslim collected this, Abu Dawood collected this, Ahmed collected this, Al-Athram collected this. Because before this time, the Hanafi are everything's in house. So we don't have to. But because of this, our jarh and ta'dil methods are connected within us. So the methodology that we're using, we are spreading it amongst ourselves and the laity, but the rest of Muslim scholarship is behind during this time. So by doing this action, Imam Al-Jawzi rahimahullah, he sets in motion a deeper study of the Sihah literature, and I'll explain how. His doing that influences a classmate of his, which is Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi rahimahullah, who died 600 Hijri, to engage in this huge study of all the narrators of the Sihah. Because the six collectors, Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, and Nasa'i, they all share most of the same narrators in common. So Imam Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi, taking from Al-Jawzi's method, does this huge study on all the narrators of the six collections. And he may have been the first one to say Sihah Sitta. He might have been, because that's as old as we can find. Now, all the narrators in the Sihah, he puts into this monster collection called Al-Kamal, which is a listing of every single narrator in Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, and Nasa'i. It gives you when they lived, their full name, when they died, something about them, how many hadith they narrated, and what collections their hadith are kept. Absolutely just first rate. Now, he breaks that down. Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah and another elder in his time, Ibn al-Manni, they do a study of not only the Sihah, but then they also do a study of the Musnad in detail, just its narrators, and the Muwatta, and Ad-Darimi. So now you have what are called the 9. So then you start talking about Rawahul Khamsa.
Okay.
The 5 have narrated. Rahu Sunan. So they start separating. Okay, the Sunan collectors have all narrated this hadith. These are the narrators from the Sunan, and they're all authentic. Or say these are the narrators from the Sahih, and they're all authentic. These are the narrators from the Musnad and Muwatta and Ad-Darimi. So now you have, when they start talking about the Tis'a, who were the Tis'a, it's the 6, Ahmed, Malik, and Ad-Darimi, right? Who were the 4? It's the 4 Sunnah, right? This language was kickstarted into place through a decision made by Imam Ibn Al-Jawzi rahimahullah in the book At-Tahqiq. This whole process was kicked into place. So he added to the science of hadith, but also revitalized it in a much deeper way.
And these books that he added, did he see them as the most authentic after the 6?
No, the books were commentaries. So for example, his At-Tahqiq fi Ahadith al-Khilaf was about the disputes between the Ahadith and Al-Bukhari and Muslim and how the different scholars see them. Then he wrote a book called Akhbar Ahl Rusukh, which is a smaller book that came before, that he wrote about the Ahadith that are abrogated. So these Ahadith are abrogated, these ones are not. Once he did that, then he went back into the Sihah, and he wrote what's called Ad-Du'afa wa Matrukin, so of the narrators that may be weak. So he scoured through those. Then he wrote a text called Al-Mawdu'at, the fabricated ahadith, where he now dealt with that's not in the Sihah, it's not in the 9. They don't have any fabricators, but outside of those and other collections, because this is post 3. Because what makes the Sihah or the 9 special is because they're taking from that first three generations.
Yes.
Those are their teachers. And so the strength of their ahadith, the strength of their narrators is unbelievable. But after that time, where you start dealing with narrators, when some people are narrating ahadith, in Imam Ahmed's time, which was the tail end of the 3rd age, and after, you start getting a profusion of people who are, if they're not lying, they're weak, or they mix things together, or their dictation skills aren't very strong because the knowledge is dissipating. So Imam Al-Jawzi rahimahullah, to deal with that topic, writes the Mawdu'at. But when it comes to the Mawdu'at, he's adopted his own methodology.
Right.
So his own methodology of judging narrators and breaking down narrators and how they are, it's a peculiar method to him. So he'll give you what's been said about these narrators, but then he'll say, but my understanding on this topic is this, because he has his criterion for judging hadith is more stringent than the Sihah or the 9. Is actually more stringent. And also he uses shorthand as well, because he assumes that the people that are reading his books have a long enough hand in the hadith science that they know when he's using shop talk and shorthand, which can be a problem if you don't study with teachers, because you could pick up that book, think that something is absolutely positively mawdu' when that's not even what the Imam is saying. But yes, go ahead.
Oh, I just want to ask, so this hadith science, the methodology that he developed, did he initially take this methodology from his own madhab, or how does something like this develop actually?
He took the science and study of hadith from his teachers, but he began to write books in the area because he became an authority in this area. And so after he had done this study on the Sihah, after he'd done the study on the Musnad, after he'd done all of these, then he engaged in the study of the Du'afa wal Matrukin, the weak and abandoned narrators. And he began doing that by scouring through Imam Ahmed's entire like everything Imam Ahmed and his students had ever pronounced upon narrators. He then built on top of that his Du'afa wal Matrukin. For the Mawdu'at, he looked at what Imam Ahmad in the early generations had said, like when someone is fabricating or they're weak, or in his early life he was strong, but now in his later life he's weak, and he looked into all these things,
Yes.
right? But his methodology in gathering the book of Mawdu'at was different.
All right.
And he actually is a little bit strict. So subsequent elders went through the book and have written like tashihat, like corrections and examinations on the book to say, okay, keep this in mind when studying this book. Keep this in mind when studying. So the book is overall good, but there are some things you have to keep in mind to understand his methodology in hadith. In hadith, he has a methodology where you have to have the entire name of the narrator. It has to be absolutely established that they met, that they exchanged hadith. It has to be absolutely established. Like for example, he prefers a hadith that were read through sama', where they were dictated in class in large bodies of people. He does not prefer the ahadith where it's one from one.
Right. Okay.
Because there's more of a margin, because one person could have a slip or a margin. He doesn't prefer those hadith. He prefers the ahadith where there's a large body of people that were in a gathering and narrated them, because that many people together are less likely to have slips or to have weakness, or for one person. And when someone slips, someone will remind the other one, right? So this is his methodology in hadith. And because of this methodology, there were things that he did in the realm of hadith that kickstarted Abdul Ghani Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi, which then led to Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah, because what Abdul Ghani and Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi did was a direct influence from Ibn al-Jawzi when he did his Umdat al-Ahkam, the Kubra and the Sughra. Because the Sughra is the one that has 514 ahadith. The Kubra has the 1051. And that was a direct influence on the back of what Imam Ibn Al-Jawzi rahimahullah had done regarding ahkam and discussions around that area. So he kind of did this. Then when Majduddin came and wrote his Al-Muntaqa, he did similar to that, but developed the science of hadith terminology. He developed the science more. So to save space and to also use the shop talk of hadith scholars. So when someone says this is related by al-Jama'ah, everyone knows that's the six. So you didn't always say Sihah Sitta, the al-Jama'ah, or this is narrated by the four. It's like, wait a minute, hold on, who are the four? Oh yeah, that's the four Sunan authors, right? This is narrated by the six. Okay, well that's all six, right? This is narrated by the five. Or the Seba, the seven, like who's the seven? Oh, so-and-so except for Ahmed. So-and-so except for this. This is narrated by everybody except the three. Who's the three? You have to understand who the six are before you understand who the three are. Right? So this is an entire science that developed in hadith. The Shaykhain, who are the Shaykhain? Well, that's Bukhari and Muslim. Right? Understanding the Ashab as-Sunan as Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, Majah, Nasai. The Sahihain, the Al-Bukhari, Muslim. This language, the shorthand language, was developed because of it was developed on the back of an impetus that was put into place by Imam Al-Jawzi rahimahullah. And that influenced Abdul Ghani, and then on the back of that thought also influenced Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah. Because of the push that was done, because you have to remember all these people are taking tutelage from each other. Like Muwaffaquddin al-Qudama, Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi, and Ibn al-Jawzi, they're in class. They're influencing each other. So what they're taking away from each other, they're inspiring one another. They're pushing one another. They're encouraging one another, and they're taking away things from one another. So the ahadith of al-Umda fil Fiqh are what's in al-Umdat al-Ahkam al-Sughra. That's what's in there. And then the Kubra is the underlying masail that are in that. So if you study that, so what happens is if you study al-Umda fil Fiqh, it's like you've studied the fiqh, but you've also done the Kubra and the Sughra, because the ahadith are all in there.
Right.
But sometimes you go through them again to refresh everything. And then al-Muntaqa deals with your ahkam. But there's an entire revolution that Imam Al-Jawzi rahimahullah started in the field of hadith that reverberated through everyone else. That impacted everyone, not just Hanbalis, but the rest of the scholars of the hadith realm. Because truth be told, because the ahadith had been collected and documented in al-Basra, that's where it was. And so people were having to come to al-Basra and Baghdad in large numbers to study the hadith sciences. So I said, okay, well, we've got to spread this out and share it with people, because it can't just be in one or two cities. Just can't be. It has to be widely expanded, as well as jarh wa ta'dil. So Imam Jawzi rahimahullah, by sharing that out, that's why when you see after Imam Jawzi's time rahimahullah, all these commentaries on hadith start showing up from other madhabs. Well, where were they before? Well, they didn't have the tools to do them, because they didn't have the jarh and ta'dil and the literature, and they couldn't. There were all these other impetuses that they have, so they were empty of a lot of these books. Not that they didn't have hadith, but the impetus and the tools to put together the shuruh that were necessary. Imam Jawzi he caused this revolution that led to that.
I'd like to understand something. The differences in the hadith sciences, does this have to do more like with locations like al-Basra, or does this have to do more with the four imams and their differences?
The differences in hadith methodology can be separated down into a few things. So what you'll find is you will find narrators that narrate a hadith from Sahaba from a particular area, because sometimes you'll get where between 3,000 and 10,000 Sahaba were full-time or partially in al-Basra. So there'll be a hadith that you'll share in common between that and al-Madinah. For example, Sa'id ibn al-Jubayr, he'd been to al-Basra. Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib was in al-Basra, but also he was in al-Madinah. So there's an overlap that's shared there. Another is the methodology in hadith that we all share in common, right? Because the methodology for disseminating and telling a liar from a truthful one, right? All these types of things, being able to distinguish that, right? That's what we have in common. But then the imams, the methodology for the use of a hadith, there'll be a slight difference. For example, you'll gather the way of Imam Ahmed and Malik to an extent, rahimahullah, is that all the ahadith will be gathered together on a particular topic. Then they'll be looked at and examined. And then the usul that are apparent from that hadith or alluded to will become the usul that you build on. But for the Hanafis, they will gather a hadith on the topic, but the one that is explicit, that agrees with the apparent meaning of ayat in the Quran on the same topic, they'll take that.
Right.
So for example, the statement there's 3 ayat in the Quran that list وَآتُوهُنَّ أَجُورَهُنَّ, so give the women their bridal gifts. It's for that reason, that ayah, the Hanafis will put with all the other ahadith on the topic that agree with that ayah. And it's because of that, they'll prefer that ayah with the ahadith that agree with it over the hadith, la nikah illa bi wali. There's no nikah except with the wali, with shahidin adlain. So they will use that, the zahir of the Quran, then those ahadith that agree with the zahir of the Quran, the apparent plain sense of the Quran, and use that as a judgment over preferring to use those rather than that hadith that says la nikah illa bi wali, because it doesn't agree with the plain sense of the Quran, the apparent meaning. So that's a completely different methodology of hadith usage. And so because of that difference, you'll produce different rulings and different methods of understanding, because the Sahaba that settled in those areas, the usul that they were using were different. And then out of those usul, you'll be having some qawa'id that will come.
And is it
ground rules.
Is it sound to say that this primarily comes down to the two groups of Ahlul Hadith and Ahlul Ray?
In a big sense, outside of what they share in common, yes. Okay. Because we're all clear on who the narrators are, who's authentic and who's not, who's valid and who's not, who's a fabricator, who's not, who's da'if and who's not, who's matruk and who's not, and who's differed in. Because sometimes someone's differed in because of at a point in his life he was weaker, and another point he was stronger, or when he narrates from this sheikh he's strong, or when he dictates and then when he narrates from memory it's different. We're all agreed on those things, right? The difference comes within implementation and usage. So you'll have several ahadith on a topic. Which one is given precedence over the other? Well, what usul are you using to come to that conclusion, right? So for those of us that adopt the methodology discussed before, la nikah illa bi wali would be used over all other ahadith. You wouldn't take a hadith that alluded to not having a wali over the hadith that's la nikah illa bi wali. So, okay, well, how do you deal with the zahir of the Quran says وَآتُوهُنَّ أَجُورَهُنَّ, and it's mu'annith. Give them, meaning the ladies, their mahr. Right? So that would make it clear that it's not required that the wali is there. To which the Hanafi responded by saying, those ayat are nothing to do with the wali. They're talking about the discharge of the mahr. It's nothing to do with the wali. So you can't say that's a zahir of the Quran on the issue of the wali when that's not listed, because the mahr can be given through the wali or directly to the girl, but this ayah has nothing to do with the wali. It's talking about the discharging of the mahr. So that doesn't fit the context. So you can't use that as a qiyas when the things in question aren't the things in question don't correspond. For the Hanafis, they would see that as a deal for Zahir Quran, right? So that's a methodology that will differ. So we're agreed upon the ahadith, the sihha and so forth, the narrators. It's which ahadith are given precedence over other and come into effect over others, and which ones are preferred versus ones that are given preference, right? That's where you'll have these issues. We're working with the same data, but how that data is implemented and which data predominates over other data. That's how you reach the conclusions that you are in. And those conclusions will go back to the Qurun al-Thalath and the Sahaba that settled those particular areas. So you're talking about Basra, Sayyid al-Musayyib, Al-Hasan, Al-Hussein, Ali, Anas ibn Malik, Utbah ibn Ghazwan, Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, right? That's just to name a few of the big names. Al-Hasan al-Basri from the Tabi'een, Muhammad ibn Sirin and his sister Hafsa, right? You have Imam Ahmed, you have Sufyan ibn Uyayna, right? You have Amr ibn Dinar. There's an entire body of people, right, that are coming from this methodology in al-Basra that then feeds into Baghdad, right? There's an entire methodology that's coming from that. So that methodology then bleeds into the methodology that you employ for implementation of the book and sunnah, right? And if you're just across the way in Al-Kufa, then the methodology we'll be looking at Zahir of Quran and the ahadith that agree with that. So you are not denying ahadith, but the ahadith that agree with the plain sense of the Quran on the topic you prefer, right? And so this is how Imam Al-Jawzi rahimahullah kicked off an entire revolution in hadith sciences, whether that was his intent or not. And his intent at the beginning of all these books, he started off by saying, when I looked at the science, when I looked at this area, I only found such and such many books, and I felt that it needed to be added to. So I will now write on this topic. That's like most books, like he'll start off, usually he'll make a comment like that. I found there was this, and then I thought there need to be more books. So I will add to this area. And he just started adding, right? And that's his methodology. So his Akhbar Ahl Rusukh is usually what you'll read before his tahqiq.
Right.
Because the way he's laid out for, okay, this is what's abrogated. Now, once you've understand what's abrogated and what's not used, you now need to understand what's different about and why. Right? Then from that, you look at your du'afa wal matrukin, right? And then you start to talk about that. Now, in the area of fiqh, Imam Al-Jawzi rahimahullah, he left behind a book that his son built on top of, known as Al-Mu'tamid. This book pretty much steers a clear line in the madhahib on fiqh topics and areas. It covers the fundamental things, but it's Imam Jawzi rahimahullah wrote it in a coded manner. So the big imams and people made reference to, sometimes there'll be a qaf or a sheen or a ra or a noon instead of their name, because it's perceived that the reader is going to know what reference is being made to. Ibn al-Jawzi rahimahullah, he has some nawadir within being a mujtahid as he is. He has some nawadir of his own.
And if I may ask you, when studying fiqh of the Hanbali madhab, Imam Ibn al-Jawzi's books are not necessarily studied as the Mu'tamid books.
No, his books are not studied as the Mu'tamid, although he's referenced, but he's not Mu'tamid.
Right.
He did not write a curriculum of fiqh, as, say, Muwaffaq al-Qudama did, or as Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah rahimahumullah did. He didn't write a curriculum. So if you study Al-Insaf, he comes up in Al-Insaf, like he's referenced regarding the placement of the hands in salah, or the 3 types of waters, or something like that, establishing things that everyone agrees on. He'll be cited as a matter of precedent to show, look, everybody is agreed, right? Or he'll be referenced, or if there's a ruling that's rare, that's rarely discussed, he'll be cited. But he's not, like, no one builds books on top of his books like shuruh and things like that. It's just not the matter that's done.
And what was his rank in ijtihad actually?
Imam al-Jawzi rahimahullah in ijtihad belonged to the mujtahidun mutlaqun fil madhhab. He belonged to these people. And he frequently stated that I do not make taqleed of anyone in my religion. My greatest imam is Ahmad ibn Hanbal. So he frequently said that, regarding, meaning he uses his usul, he uses the usul of the madhhab, and he builds a discussion on the usul and the qawaid of the madhhab. So he would sometimes come with rare rulings, or rulings where he reached a conclusion on things. Like he extended, he was clear that there are 3 types of waters, but because the expressions tahur, tahir, and najis are not laid out specifically in hadith, he did not lay out his fiqh book like that.
Oh, wow.
So he would discuss the different types of waters, but he would avoid using that expression, because he said this is coming from an ijtihad built on top of the other ahadith and everything else, and it's a qiyas that's built on the hadith, but it's not specifically established in wording, so therefore I will not use it.
And it shows his meticulousness in following the first 3 generations.
Yes, and it's understood. People thought it was very parochial, because you're still using the terminology. Like, you'll still say the types of water are 3. Then he'll start quoting ayat, everything else. Well, these ayat, you have the word najis in them.
Okay, I see.
These ayat have, like, it's clear that these ahadith are referring to tahir water. Even if you're not using the word tahir, it's clear that it's referring to tahur water that's been mixed with something else that's now become tahir. It's clear that that's what we're talking about. Why is it so hard to just put tahirs? But he just was really meticulous about that. Now, in terms of his writings in Ihsan, His writings in Ihsan were very detailed. Now, in Hadith, he has left behind a legacy of 12 books in Hadith. Yeah, 12 books that cover various topics on Hadith. Now, when it comes to Ihsan and Zuhud, he has left behind some 5 books on that topic. Okay? Now, one such book is his Al-Tib al-Ruhani, which means spiritual medicine. And this deals with when the human being, when the nafs, the ruh, and the jasad are out of alignment. In order to have a complete Muslim established upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ways he's meant to be, these 3 things have to be in alignment. So in this 97-page book, Imam Al-Jawzi rahimahullah discusses how to bring these things in alignment, reasons why they come out of alignment. Someone said that this book is like one of the first books that you could call psychology. While I appreciate the ode to Imam Al-Jawzi rahimahullah, his creativeness and his trailblazing, I'm not sure if we could call it psychology in the Western sense of psychology, because when we talk about psychology in the Western sense, they reject the existence of the soul, and they believe that the human being's existence is consciousness, which is composed as you have the id, the superego, and the ego, and man's life force. And when that's extinguished, then the rest of it is extinguished. But if you meant psychology as a catch-all term for man being balanced in himself, in terms of his mind, his body, and his ruh, so that he can discharge his obligations to his Lord in the best way possible, then I suppose you could call it that in a sort of catch-all sense, because it does cover that. He also wrote a book called Al-Mawlid, which is a poetic dedication to the Prophet ﷺ, which covers things from before he was born all the way up to his birth, up to his death, and the miracles that happened after that time. The way he's written it, you can tell it's meant to be read in a gathering, like as if it's a medah. It's like a medah that's read in a gathering. So you can tell, like, okay, this part must be the chorus, and then these parts here are to be read by an individual reader. Subhanallah. Yeah. So he wrote that. He also wrote Al-Wafa bi Ahwal al-Mustafa, which is, some people say it's Sirah, but it's Sirah, but it also has the life lessons from the Sirah as well. And it looks to be the case that he's built this kitab on top of Imam Ibn Hisham rahimahullah's As-Sirah al-Nabawiyah, but also included like life lessons, ahkam you can take from it, wisdoms of how it applies now, why we should follow these things. Like he has these little fawaid that he'll insert, and then he'll also have deeper like asrar, like secrets you can take away from this. Like, okay, what are the deeper meanings of why this happened? Right. Another kitab he has is Minhaj al-Qasidin, which is 5 volumes in most print houses, 4 in some, which is his mukhtasar of Ihya Ulum al-Din by Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah. Imam al-Jawzi in this kitab tries to remove all newfangled tasawwuf references and newfangled fiqh references not from the first 3 generations. So he does this huge rework of this book. He also makes no reference in the kitab to tasawwuf. He removes this term and all tasawwuf-based references. He removes all these because, again, it was not popularly used in this way in the first 3 generations.
Is he avoiding the terminology?
Yeah, he's avoiding terminology.
Right.
But The ayat, then also a hadith that, because you have to remember, he's a hafiz and a muhaddith as well. So now he's going through and saying, a hadith that were mawdu' or da'if, I've not included. So now he's removed some of the ahadith. So what you're left with is it's a mukhtasar of the iyyah, but it's also partially an abridgment as well. Well, another big elder, Najmuddin al-Maqdisi, who died 689 Hijri, rahimahullah, he would do a mukhtasar of that called Mukhtasar Minhaj al-Qasidin, which is in one slim volume. And it's still read. I mean, we were reading it in London. One of my teachers used to read sections of it. And it's separated into 4 quarters, just like how Minhaj al-Qasidin was and just how the Ihyā was. So what's happened is you had the Ihyā, then it was summarized into Minhaj al-Qasidin, which was then summarized into Mukhtasar Minhaj al-Qasidin.
And it would be used as a daily reference in Ihsan.
Yes, daily reference in Ihsan, good character, and all the hadith in there, because of Imam Al-Jawzi rahimahullah's work, are coming from the Sihah. So all the hadith are from the Sihah. So any hadith that aren't from the Sihah are not in there.
Right.
That's generally what he's done. So they'll be from the Sihah or the Tisa. They'll be from the 9. So there's a few from the Musnad, the Muwatta, and some from Darimi. But there won't be any outside of that usually, other than like Tabarani. But Tabarani and Darimi share many of the same narrators. That's the methodology he's employed. Then you have Talbis Iblis, which was preceded by Sayd al-Khatir.
Okay.
And Sayd al-Khatir is a collection of his thoughts, but most of his thoughts are to do with outrages that he sees in Ihsan and Tasawwuf, Ilm al-Kalam, and theological matters. So Sayd al-Khatir is usually referenced before Talbis Iblis.
Okay.
Because Sayd al-Khatir, it militates the harsh tone of Talbis Iblis. Because if someone reads Talbis Iblis, someone could think that he despises Tasawwuf and the Sufiya. But this is incorrect.
Right.
So Sayd al-Khatir is the balance, it's the counterbalance. By reading Sayd al-Khatir and then reading Talbis, that is the counterbalance, so that you don't go to one side versus the other.
And I believe you once mentioned that you had to read Talbis Iblis alongside Sirr al-Asrar of Shaykh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani.
Yes, we did have to read this as targeted reading, because you see the failing points of the people of Tasawwuf. Because again, in every science, you have mujaddidun, you have renewers, you have mujtahidun, you have people of ijtihad and effort and knowledge, but then you also have mukhti'un, you have people who make mistakes. And then that has to be caught by the muhaqqiqun, the researchers. So every science has like these bodies of people. We've got muhaqqiqun, like the muhaqqiq in like hadith and creed. Like one of the most recent muhaqqiq is Imam As-Safarini, to the point that he's called al-muhaqqiq. Like whenever something comes up and says, oh, al-muhaqqiq has said, who's that? That's Imam As-Safarini. Because he is the checker when it comes to hadith stuff or when it comes to creedal stuff. The muhaqqiq, like he's called the muhaqqiq, the checker. And sometimes he's called khatim al-muhaqqiqin, the seal of the muhaqqiqin. Because we've not seen anyone since his time that's been as thorough in research and checking things over. I mean, he is thorough. There's things where I've checked printed copies against him and found like printed copies of books are wrong, because he cites directly from manuscript. So when I have like printed copies of stuff, I'll check it against some of the things he'll have. And I'll be like, there's a discrepancy here. and then I'll check a manuscript and find Safarini right. So I'll use Safarini to check against printed books. He's that rigorous. He's extremely rigorous in fiqh, in i'tiqad, in hadith. He's extremely rigorous. He has a monster sharh on Umdat al-Ahkam, and he also has a smaller sharh on the Musnad where he talks about it. But that one is only topped by another big elder who was contemporary to his time, which is Nuruddin as-Sindhi, big hadith scholar from India. But he came to Mecca. And he may have met Safarini. He might have, because there's a lot that they share in common in terms of like their methods of tahqiq. I'd say Nuruddin as-Sindhi is like one of the greatest muhaqqiqeen of like that period. And along with Safarini, it is a huge figure. But Ibn Al-Jawzi, rahimahullah, his methodology is one in which, like most of the Hanabila, he'll write books in a series. He'll write a set of kutub, right? So as you see, Muwaffiq Qudama wrote like 6 books in fiqh, just wrote a series of books, right? He wrote like 5 books in i'tiqad, just wrote a series of them, right? Narrators, he wrote like 2 books, like, so they'll write like a series. And they're not just a series of books, they're laid out like a curriculum. So you can follow it and be built up in a systematic way. So at the end of it, you're knowledgeable in that field to where you kind of know your way around. Even if you're not a scholar, you'll know your way around if you've read it with someone and you've been guided right and you've gone through the proper steps.
And does this also lead into him being able to move on to different projects? So he has finished this and then he finished the next.
That's correct. So he'll go into all these affairs, and then as he goes through and lays down these books on individual sciences, he'll then move forward onto something else. And you'll say, subhanallah, he's just moved ahead. He'll just move ahead and do something else.